Hi everyone, it's Dr. Marks, and we're continuing in our discussion of supply and demand problems. Up to this point, we've done fairly basic problems where for each graph there was only one shock. So maybe we had a demand increase in a market, or maybe we had a supply increase in a market. But what we're going to do now is what's probably the hardest type of question, and I don't even think you're going to find them that hard. But we want to know what happens when we have two shocks in the same market. So this is going to require you to graph this in a certain way. And I'm going to show you a procedure that I think is the best. You might have been taught differently by another professor if you're repeating Econ 217. But I truly think this is the method that will keep you from making the most careless mistakes. And I'm going to show you why. So let's begin with an example. Well, let's say that we're talking about the market for X. And it doesn't matter what good X is. But in the market for X, we observe that there's a technological advance. So whatever the production process is, we have a technological advance in production of X. But at the same time, and that's going to be kind of a key phrase I might use, at the same time, we also observe that number of demanders is on the rise. And we want to know how these occurrences affect the market for good X. Now notice the word these. I'm going to try to use language like that to help you remember, hey, I'm looking at more than one shock. So we're still going to follow the three steps. Remember the three steps. First, identify the shock. Second, you need to draw the graphs. Third, talk about equilibrium, price, and quantity. But because there are two shocks, we need to do something different. So let's start by identifying the shocks. Well, we know that the first shock is that there's a technological advance. We know that a technological advance is going to be a supply shift, right? So you need to tell me technological advance is going to cause supply of X to do what? Increase. But at the same time, we see that number of demanders is on the rise. So number of demanders increases. And of course, that's a demand curve shift, right? So we know that the demand for X is going to go up. So we have two shocks in the same market. Now I want to be very clear. We only do what I'm about to show you if we have two shocks in the same market. And by same market, they're both in X. So this is different than saying, look, there's a quota for foreign sugar, and that affects demand for domestic sugar, right? If we're talking about a quota impacting foreign sugar, and then something causing a demand increase for domestic sugar, those are not the same market. So that's not the kind of problem I'm talking about. All right, we know the second step. We need to draw our graphs. So again, this is going to be the market for X. We've got our downward sloping demand and our upward sloping supply. Of course, remember to label your axes. Remember, you're not going to shift anything until you've labeled your equilibrium. So here's equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. All right, market for X. But I'm going to do the same exact thing over here. So I'm basically just going to duplicate my effort. So this is also going to be the market for X. If my two graphs don't look identical, it's not really going to be a problem. You'll see that in a moment. Okay. So I have two graphs of the market for good X in equilibrium. On the first graph, we're going to draw our supply increase. So a supply increase, remember, is a shift to the right. So I've shifted my supply curve to the right. That's a supply increase. I've labeled it something new. And I've got a new equilibrium. That gives me a new equilibrium price of P1 and a new equilibrium quantity of Q1. So last step, if you remember, is we have to summarize the impact on equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Do you agree that the technological advance makes price go down, right? Because we see that price decrease from P0 to P1, and we see quantities going up. But that is the effect only of the technological advance, and we still have the demand shock to contend with. So let's draw our demand shock. So I'm on the right side now. Number of demanders increased, so that causes demand to go up. I've shifted my demand curve to the right, and again, I'm labeling my new demand curve D1. Price is P1. Quantity is Q1. So I need to summarize the effect of just the demand shock. Equilibrium price has gone up, and equilibrium quantity has gone up. All right. Now, the next step is really important because we've said that these two shocks have happened at the same time, right? It wasn't one after the other, but kind of basically at the same time period. So now what we have to do is combine our two effects. Well, let's look at quantity. Do we agree that the supply shock caused quantity to go up, and the demand shock also caused quantity to go up? So I know with certainty that the equilibrium quantity is going to go up. But what's not so clear is what happens to equilibrium price. Now, the supply shock has caused price to go down, but the demand shock on the right has caused price to go up. I don't have any information here telling me which shock is bigger. So without knowing which shock is bigger, I don't know which the dominant effect is. So I'm simply going to have to say, I don't know. A better way of saying that, though, is what you're going to see me say, is that this is indeterminate. In other words, we don't know what's happening to price. So the effect on price from these two shocks together is indeterminate, but we know with certainty that quantity is going to go up. Now again, and I'm going to keep repeating this, and I apologize, but I want everyone to be clear, this combining only makes sense when I'm looking at two shocks in the same market. And here they're the same market. Market for X, market for X. Let's do another example. Now let's say we're in the market for good Y. And in the market for good Y, we observe that price of inputs to Y, in other words, the things that we use to produce Y, are going up. And at the same time, we have a recession. So the U.S. enters a recession. And of course, during a recession, incomes are falling. So the U.S. enters a recession. We know incomes are falling during a recession. Of course, we need to know what kind of good this is. So let's say that Y is a normal good. So we have two shocks, and now we want to know how do these occurrences impact the market for good Y. So we're going to go through the same exact steps. So first, we need to identify our shocks. So we see that price of inputs are going up. We know that's a supply shifter. So the supply of good Y is doing what? Is this good for you as a producer or bad for you? Well, it's bad for you when your inputs get more expensive. Your supply is going to go down. At the same time, we've got the U.S. entering a recession. Incomes are falling. So we've got incomes fall. And we know Y is a normal good. Of course, that's a demand shifter. So what happens here? If incomes are falling and Y is a normal good, then do we agree the demand for good Y is going to fall, right? We move away from normal goods when our income falls. Okay, so step one, we're done. We've identified our two shifters. We've given nice, thorough CPA statements. So next, we need to draw our graphs. And remember, both of these are market for Y. So I'm going to label that market for Y and market for Y. All right, so put in your demand curves, put in your supply curve, equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity. I'm going to do the same thing on the right. So downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply. All right. So remember, you don't shift anything until your graph is completely labeled equilibrium, axes, supply and demand curves, all. All right. So let's start on the left. We have a supply decrease. Remember, a supply decrease is a shift to the left. Remember, it's never up and down unless we're talking about a tariff where it shifts up, but the rest of the time it's left or right. So our new supply curve I'm calling S1. That gives me a new equilibrium with an equilibrium price of P1 and an equilibrium quantity of Q1. So the supply effect alone causes equilibrium price to go up. You see that right here. And equilibrium quantity also goes up. I'm sorry, it goes down. My bad. Sorry. Equilibrium quantity goes down. All right, you with me? Let's do the same thing on the right-hand side. On the right-hand side, we've got a demand decrease. So we need to shift our demand curve to the left. We'll label it D1. So equilibrium price is P1. Equilibrium quantity is Q1. So now we can summarize the effect on price. We see price is going down. So equilibrium price has gone down. And we see equilibrium quantity go down. Okay. Remember, on the left, this is the result only from the supply decrease. And this is the result only from the demand decrease. Are we done? The answer is no, because the last step is that we have to combine. These shocks happen at the same time. So if they happen at the same time, then I have to combine the effects. Well, again, it just happens to work out that we can tell what's happening to quantity. We see that quantity is decreasing in both of these shocks. So both the supply and demand shock cause quantity to fall. So quantity is going down. But what's not so clear is equilibrium price. So again, here on the left, the supply shock makes price go up, but the demand shock makes price go down. We don't know which shock is bigger. So again, we don't know. We'll have to say it's indeterminate. Now, you might be thinking, okay, wait a minute. In both of these examples, price was indeterminate, right? Let's take a look back. Price was indeterminate in our last example, but quantity went up. And here price is indeterminate, but quantity is going down. I want to be very clear that that's a coincidence. I can really have 4 different outcomes, right? So I can have an outcome where price goes up and quantity is indeterminate. Actually, I'm going to have 8, right? I can have price going down and quantity is indeterminate. I can have, 4. Price, what's wrong with me? I can have price be indeterminate. And quantity go up and price be indeterminate and quantity go down. So again, my bad. So 4 possible outcomes. Do you notice though, there's always something that's indeterminate, right? Well, if I have a supply and a demand shock in the same market, then I'm going to have conflicting information for either price or quantity where I don't know. Now, let's go back for 1 second. Let's take a look at this example here. What if I gave you more information? What if I had told you that this shock was larger and this shock over here was smaller? Whatever that even means, right? If I know that the supply shock is really big, but the demand shock is small, now might I know something? Now let's take a look. If I know this shock is large, then I know I'm going to have a bigger price increase. And if this shock on the right is small, I'm going to have a smaller price decrease. Then when I add them together, what can I conclude? Probably price is going to go up. But I didn't initially tell you that, right? I didn't tell you which shock was bigger. So if I don't tell you which shock is bigger, then you're going to end up with something being indeterminate. All right, you with me? Now, here I've asked you to draw 2 separate graphs, but notice they're both the same, market for good Y and market for good Y. You might be tempted to put these on the same graph, but I want to make it very clear that you cannot actually show the right answer on one graph. Now it looks like quantity fell, right?